Our board host and first questioner is Vivian Solomon, member of the Board of Governors and partner with, I think we've already given you that, haven't we? We'll skip over that. The second question will be asked by Greg McPherson, whom you just elected second vice president. Then, as you know, we open the floor to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone at the center of the room. Keep your questions to 30 seconds. I'll time you. And no speeches, not even mini speeches, please. U.S. Representative Peter DeFazio is serving his 5th term in the Congress of the United States. He is a member of the House Resources Committee, where he serves as ranking Democrat on the Water and Power Subcommittee with jurisdiction over the Bonneville Power Administration. He chaired a task force on BPA and authored a respected report on the future of that agency in a world of rapidly changing energy markets. He is also a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where he serves on the Surface Transportation and Aviation subcommittees, all important work for the state of Oregon and for his district. Because of his active participation in resources and his great concern about clean water, I have a special recognition for him that comes from someone who wanted to present this to him earlier today, and somehow it didn't work out, so City Club is proud to pick up that chore. In effect, there are 3 members of the Oregon congressional delegation who stood up for clean water, primarily by opposing the so-called Schuster Bill, which many believe would set us back a few decades with respect to the progress we've made. One of them is our speaker today. Because of his stand for clean water, the Portland Bureau of Environmental Services has singled out Representative DeFazio and his colleagues Elizabeth First and Ron Wyden for some special recognition. Representative DeFazio, on behalf of the City of Portland, Bureau of Environmental Services, may I present you with this Clean River Works Award. The problem with it, it's so big you can't put it in a pocket. Someone's going to have to help him carry it off. But it's a lot. Peter DeFazio has been an outspoken critic of many of the provisions of the Republican contract with America. He is considered by some as a maverick on trade issues, differing repeatedly with most of his Northwest colleagues on such issues as NAFTA and the $40 billion peso stabilization program. Peter lives with his wife, Myrnie, in Springfield, Oregon, and continues the grueling commute to and from Washington, D.C. about 3 times a month. Congressman, we're pleased that you are here and not commuting today to share your views on anything you want to talk about, but in the bulletin it says, the new political environment, searching for solutions. Congressman.
To President Frisbee, my thanks, and my thanks for the presentation of the award from the city. I only hope that it doesn't become a historic artifact. One point I raised during the debate in committee and on the floor was that there must be some awfully short memories in the Congress. Can't anyone remember that actually in the 1960s the Cuyahoga River was so polluted that it caught fire, and that in the 50s the Willamette River was considered an open sewer and now is a tremendous asset, fishable, drinkable, swimmable, on a priceless legacy of actual effective laws that deal with clean water. And the bill you'll hear more about later. Someone might direct a question to it, but we didn't refer to it as Clean Water Act. We referred to it as Bud Schuster's Dirty Water Act, and it truly is a radical step backwards. Not dealing with some of the procedural problems of the current law, but actually repealing the goals of clean water and fishable, drinkable, swimmable water available to all Americans. And to Don Barney, my envy of that unanimous consent request you pulled off. I don't know how you wired that. I haven't seen a crowd yet where there isn't somebody who's going to want to stand up and say, reserving the right to object. Perhaps I can get some parliamentary procedure and political hints from you now that you've stepped down from the presidency, and take them back to Washington, D.C. I've come today, you've heard the sort of formal title, and what I'm going to talk about is Twin Peaks. And, you know, not the television show going off the air, but the Twin Peaks of the deficits that confront our nation. First, I'll spend most of my time on the federal budget, and then secondly, I'll talk about the trade deficit, and I won't dwell too much on the charts since I know we have a lot of radio listeners, but I'll try and be illustrative in my comments. You know, earlier this year we had the balanced budget amendment debate. I came and spoke to this club 5 years ago when I became a convert on the issue of the balanced budget amendment, and the title of the speech was something about, you know, what's a liberal doing supporting the balanced budget amendment. And I sketched out a world where the overwhelming obligations of the debt and the deficit were such that I believed it would begin to wipe out the programs that I cared so much about, and the capability of the federal government to deal with many of the problems I saw confronting our people. And I have been, for those 5 years, an active and avid advocate of the balanced budget amendment, not because I think it's a great construct or belongs in the Constitution, but because I thought we needed to impose some limits on the policymakers in Washington, D.C. And though that failed by a single vote in the Senate, I think perhaps Senator Hatfield, who I respect tremendously, and I respect his integrity on this issue, who cast the deciding vote against, he said, we have the tools we need now, let us get on with the work. And actually it seems that his words may have been prophetic, because indeed every budget alternative offered in the House and the Senate, Democrat and Republican, from whatever perspective, conservative, progressive, the Black Caucus so-called budget in the House, every one of those budget alternatives offered this year would bring, or at least on paper, bring the federal budget into balance by the year 2002. I think that debate is behind us. We are going to instill fiscal responsibility. You cannot go on infinitely spending more money than you take in every year. You refer to the chart, and you see they're a little too minuscule to see from the back, but the little blue lines above are the few years that we have had surpluses since World War II. There's about 7 of them, and one of them is actually LBJ. When LBJ cooked the books in 1968-69, the Vietnam War deficits had gotten so large he decided to plow Social Security into the general fund budget for the first time since the inception of Social Security, thereby showing artificially a 1-year surplus and diffusing some of the criticism about the war expenditures. However, since that time, you can see the trend line. It's very bad. Those on the extreme right, those longest lines, are actually a little different color. They're pink. They're projected. If we did not get serious about balancing the budget and we continued current expenditures, that would be the trend line. We have today nearly $5 trillion of federal debt, $17,000 from the tiniest newborn baby to the oldest senior citizen per capita. That's up from a national debt of $900 billion in 1980. We've gone from $900 billion of debt accumulated over 200 years to $5 trillion in a scant 15 years. If we continue that trend, pretty clearly we're going to become bankrupt. The second largest item of expenditure in the federal budget this year after the military, and I exclude, unlike LBJ, I don't plow Social Security into the general fund budget because it's a dedicated trust fund expenditure. But when you look at the general fund, the largest expenditure is the military. The second largest expenditure is interest on the debt, $203 billion. 10 times our investment in education will go to servicing the debt. 12 times our investment in infrastructure will go to servicing the debt. This does not bode well for the future if we infinitely increase that burden. So I welcome the new attitude in Washington, but now the real fight is joined. And that is where we have the opportunities, and that is in setting the priorities to reach a balanced budget. I have a severe disagreement with the new majority in the House over the priorities they've set. We have to cut $900 billion in savings between now and the year 2002 in order to get to a balanced budget from projected expenditures. What they do in approaching that is first increase that to $1.25 trillion by beginning to balance the budget by decreasing revenues by $350 billion. It seems a bit stupid to me, if you're serious about dealing with the debt and deficit of this nation, to begin by increasing the magnitude of that problem. And in particular, the tax breaks that they push through the House, 50% of the personal tax breaks will flow to people who earn over $100,000. That is, 2% of the population will get 50% of the tax breaks. And on the corporate side, they're going to repeal the corporate alternative minimum tax, something that was put into place in a bipartisan way with Ronald Reagan and a Democratic Congress because it was so embarrassing to see that the largest and most profitable corporations in the land, such as AT&T with $1.4 billion of profits over 5 years, had not only not paid federal taxes during those 5 years, but had gotten a $300 million tax credit for taxes it didn't pay, which the rest of us contributed through our own taxes. So we put in place a corporate alternative minimum tax to say that there will never be, if you are a profitable corporation, a way to totally escape your responsibility. That is repealed in this bill. We do not deal, they do not deal in that bill with other sorts of subsidies. You know, we are unique among the developed nations in the way we tax foreign and multinational corporations. We essentially allow them to downstream their profits to the lowest tax country they can find to operate in and avoid obligation to pay taxes in the United States of America. None of our competitors in the G7 do that. They all have a unitary tax system. If 50% of your product is sold in Japan, you're going to pay taxes on about 50% of your profits. You can't downstream it. Honda can sell 50% of its product here and pay zero in federal income taxes. The estimates are we could raise $40 to $60 billion a year from foreign and multinational corporations if we just adopted the same tax system used by every one of our economic competitors. I think that makes sense. It would be a level playing field, and that's in an area of trade where I don't agree with my colleagues. They say, oh, that would cause corporations to not operate or move out of the United States. Well, then, why are they operating and moving into all of our competitor nations and operating from those nations? That does not make sense to me. We also have to deal with agriculture subsidies. I think if we're serious about getting to a balanced budget by the year 2002, we should phase out all agriculture subsidies in that time period. We should substantially, and again, I would stand probably alone in the Northwest delegation, phase out foreign aid during that same time period. It does not make sense to me that we are borrowing money to give to other nations when we ourselves are so much in debt. Certainly, we want to guarantee our treaty commitments, and we want to continue to be a participant in the world community. But I believe there are ways to do that without handing over billions of dollars every year to a few countries and hundreds of millions to others when most of the money never gets to the people who really need it. I also don't believe that in the post-Cold War era we need to increase military spending by $92 billion, which is what the budget passed in the House would do. Again, remember, we're headed toward a balanced budget, and these are all the things that they're not doing or doing. decreasing taxes by $350 billion, not going after agriculture subsidies substantially, not going after foreign aid substantially, and not going after corporate loopholes. Beyond that, increasing the military by $92 billion, increasing Star Wars this year from $2.9 billion, which is a waste of money, to $3.7 billion, which is an even bigger waste of money. Remember, what has Star Wars done? It has spent $43 billion. What are the results? One test over the Pacific where they seemed to have intercepted an incoming missile, but it turned out, and the Pentagon admitted later, that actually they didn't intercept it. They put explosives in it and detonated it by remote control. That's for $43 billion. We have this vision that somehow this will make the country safe against a non-existent threat. No terrorist nation is going to attack the United States with a missile because we would obliterate that nation in response. But they might choose a terrorist means to attack us, and we aren't addressing that effectively. We aren't addressing that by building 10 more B-2 bombers, the stealth bombers that the Pentagon doesn't even want as a jobs program. That's in this year's budget. By continuing the space station, which was supposed to cost $9 billion, has cost so far $14 billion, and they don't even have working drawings yet, and they don't have a mission, and they're now saying it may cost $40 billion. I'm for science. But the question is, in a time of tight budgets, is it best to put all of our money into that, or should we diversify into other areas of space exploration and unmanned space exploration, things that have potentially more benefits and are much less expensive, and spread the risk a little further? So I've drawn up my own alternative of a budget which goes after those corporate tax loopholes, dramatically decreases military spending to a point which I think is commensurate to the defense needs and the real threats confronting this nation for the foreseeable future. And I use the Pentagon's own threat list to come up with that budget. But I don't do certain things that are in this same budget. I don't go after education. I don't go after the investments that we're making in the future of this country. You know, I got subsidized student loans. I'm proud to stand in front of you and say that. I got a little bit of help. I worked. My parents helped as much as they could. I got work study. I worked summers, and I worked during this college year. Now, we're not going to make that available to the next generation of Americans who need to go to ever more expensive colleges with ever declining prospects in terms of the initial wages they might receive. That, in this budget, is eliminated. Now, there was a colleague of mine who stood up on the floor after one of the members of my party made this point, J.D. Hayworth, fellow from Arizona, he's a sportscaster, I guess, before he came to Congress. And he stood up, held up a picture of his daughter and says, since you're holding up pictures, here's a picture of my daughter. And tell you what, this deficit is so awesome and such a problem. My daughter is willing to give up her subsidized student loan in order to get the budget balanced. Well, I was watching on television. I wasn't going to speak that day, but I got so mad I stomped down to the floor. And I felt constrained to point out to Mr. Hayworth that with a $133,000 a year salary, his daughter actually wasn't eligible for a subsidized student loan. So she and he weren't giving up much of anything. So, you know, we have to inject some reality into this debate because we are shaping really the budget of the United States for the next 7 to 10 years with the priorities we set this year in Washington, D.C. I think they're the wrong priorities. The headline in the Oregonian today shows that this short-sightedness not only prevails in Washington, D.C., because in the budget in Washington, D.C., they zeroed out high-speed light rail, they zeroed out Amtrak, they cut the contribution to light rail and mass transit by 50%, they did away with operating assistance for mass transit authorities. All that's in the federal budget, and then I come home to Oregon and I think, well, at least I'm home and this is an island of sanity, and I pick up the Oregonian this morning and there's a headline that the Oregon legislature is going to zero out its assistance for the extension of the light rail and for the future of this community. I think that is very short-sighted. These are investments we need to be making in the next generation of Americans and in the physical infrastructure and the economic competitiveness of our country. Now a word on economic competitiveness. The chart on my left. Another chart almost as ugly. This is trade deficits. We, the United States of America, were the world's essentially banker from 1917 till 1982. We were a trade surplus nation for all those many years, and the rest of the world owed us more than we owed them. In 1982, our deficits had accumulated to a point where we broke even, and then after that we began to become a world debtor. And we have accumulated since 1982 in 13 years over $1 trillion of international debt. Over $1 trillion. Now people say, you ask the administration, how's the trade policy? They'll say, well, we think it's working just fine. Well, How is it working just fine if we ran a $163 billion trade deficit last year? The Commerce Department measures things, and they say for every $1 billion of trade, 23 jobs are created or destroyed. What they don't want to say, but if you use their own logic, that is, if you run a $163 billion trade deficit, you just destroyed or exported 3.2 million jobs. And you can't do that year in and year out until something happens, like maybe the dollar drops to 80 yen, which happened this year. And we continue down this path, following the dictates of an economist who's been dead for more than 200 years, Adam Smith. And there are only two nations on earth that really follow the dictates of Adam Smith: the United States and Great Britain. And Great Britain, as you know, is somewhat of a basket case economy, and they are the only industrial power with whom we are running a surplus. We are running a deficit with every other industrial power in the world. It's time to rethink our trade policy. I'm not a protectionist. I'm not someone who's saying we should be isolationist, but I am a realist, and I want to approach trade issues the same way that other countries have, in the national interest, with the national interest of a high-wage, high-skill, high-technology strategy, future development for your own economy. That's the way all our competitors approach it, and that does mean, yes, a little bit of management and trade. Two quick examples. NAFTA. Before we entered into NAFTA, many of us said, now wait a minute, why don't we do this the way the Europeans did it? You know, the EEC didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's let in Portugal and Greece and other low-wage countries. They said, Portugal, Greece, you want to be part of the EEC. This is about 15 years ago. We don't want you in until you make some changes because you are so low wage, you don't have labor protections, you don't have environmental protections, you really don't even have democratic systems. We don't want to compete with you. We don't want to see our capital flee across the borders and produce in your countries and ship the goods back. So you adopt these reforms, you adopt labor protections, you raise your standards of living, you make infrastructure investments, you do all those things and we'll let you in. Well, that happened. Well, we did the opposite. We looked at Mexico with a standard of living 1/10 of ours, and we said, oh, this is a great market for the U.S. Let's enter into a borderless agreement and we'll export all sorts of things and create jobs in this country. Well, that was counterintuitive from the beginning. The total purchasing power of Mexico, if they spent every single peso before devaluation on U.S. goods and didn't buy anything made in Mexico or grown in Mexico, is equal to the purchasing power of the state of New Jersey. So pretty clearly, we were never going to see some tremendous economic boom from having a borderless agreement with Mexico. And pretty clearly, it was intended for something else. It was intended to be an export platform for some of our competitors, the Japanese and others, to move in, and for U.S. manufacturers to chase cheap labor and get away from environmental restrictions. And the agreement was written that way. The environmental restrictions are absolutely toothless. In fact, they're not even part of the treaty. They were done as an annex, and they have no binding effect. Beyond that, we said we expect that the peso is overvalued, they'll devalue it, and they'll have even less purchasing power. We couldn't have anticipated a 50% devaluation. That was catastrophic for the Mexican people. And so far this year, we have run over a $3 billion trade deficit with Mexico. The Mexicans are projecting that by next year, we will run an annual $20 billion trade deficit with Mexico for the indefinite future, and that's how they intend to pay off their debts, by running a $20 billion trade surplus with the United States. That means, if you use the Commerce Department's own measures, that we are going to see the export of the capital and or actual manufacturing infrastructure for some, 20 times 20, 400,000 jobs to Mexico. And now, to add insult to injury, we are having to pay, and I'd use a less polite word for the recapitalization or whatever polite word it was Don used, we call it the bailout of Mexico. This does not seem like a great deal to me. So we need a new theory of trade, and we need to approach this in such a way that it is done in the national interest, done to promote some American values. I, for one, unlike the President, do not reject the idea that when we enter trade partnerships with people, we project some of our values on them. When we give special recognition to China with MFN, and they're engaging in nuclear, they're supplying nuclear technology to terrorist nations. They're horribly oppressing their own people, and we give them most favored nation status because of the pressure of a few large corporations in the United States that feel it's in their interests, and yet we won't recognize Cuba because they're such a horrible, oppressive regime. These are absurdities, and we have to get through that. We need a new reality in trade as much as we need a new reality in terms of our budget and budget priorities. So, I'm here to say that, We have some incredible decisions confronting the Congress in the coming year and the years before us. We need a little bit of new thinking. We need to grasp at new opportunities. And we also have to get something firmly fixed in our mind about our priorities. Our priorities for ourselves as a domestic economy and for investment in our people and our infrastructure and ourselves in the international community where we project American ideals and we also engage in trade policies that bring a bit more prosperity to our own people. I think that its time has come certainly to engage in this debate, and I'm only hopeful that people are listening and we all enter into this with a little bit of flexibility and see if maybe we can do things different, because these mounds of red ink on both sides of me show that it hasn't been working what we've been doing for the last quarter of a century. Thanks very much. I appreciate your attention.
Congressman, thank you. You make your opinions and your knowledge very understandable, very clear. And I think that calls for some questioning on the part of this audience. And as I said earlier, let's start out with Vivian Solomon. Vivian, will you come up, please?
I'm interested in your views on the new political environment in Congress. We've heard about Ralph Reed and the contract with the American family, which may be coming up soon, and I'd like to hear your views on where that's going to go.
Well, unlike the contract with America, we saw pretty much unprecedented block voting in the House of Representatives on the issue of the contract on America. Newt Gingrich held his caucus's feet to the fire, even some moderates who wanted to skate on some of the issues on everything except term limits, and on that one he let them have a free vote. They could vote however they wanted. But on everything else, he held their feet to the fire. Now, what was promised to some of the new right-wing ideologues was your time will come. And their time is the 10 precepts or the 10 commandments of Mr. Reed's agenda. But the difference is Mr. Gingrich is not going to demand that his caucus hold together on those. They're going to have to look to try and hold enough Republicans and pull off enough conservative Democrats to push through some of the aspects of this second contract. I predict very different results. I think that a substantial portion of it will not be implemented. And in particular, one of the first things we'll see and one of the first tests will be an attempt at a constitutional amendment mandating, federally mandating, prayer in the schools. And I think they're going to run their train into a wreck on that one, and we'll see. And then they were going to follow after that with some of the less startling parts of the contract. But I predict that they will not prevail with the 2/3 in the House on that issue, and that this next contract will be settled much more in a normal legislative environment than what's prevailed in the first 100 days.
Greg, you've been overruled, or I've been overruled. Richard Pagnano will give the second question. Richard?
Representative DeFazio, it's been suggested that there will be some drastic cuts in both Medicare and Medicaid. As you know, these are two programs that the elderly and disabled and low-income individuals in our country rely on for their health care needs. I'm wondering what your forecast is for these two programs that are very important for many of the individuals, elderly and disabled, in our country.
Well, Ron Wyden and I are the two gerontologists in Congress, so I think we're both very qualified to speak on this, and I think our opinions are together on this issue. You know, it's funny. There was a crisis in Medicare last year. Actually, last year we were predicting Medicare would go broke 1 year earlier in terms of the trust fund. But somehow, in the drawing up of the Republican contract, in the context of the elections, even in the context of President Clinton's health care proposal, which had a lot of problems, we didn't hear this from the then minority party. There was no crisis. This year we went through the contract. Again, there did not seem to be a crisis. It wasn't one of the 10 major items. We did an emergency spending bill and a rescissions bill. Again, it was not a crisis. Suddenly, after we passed the budget, after there's a $350 billion tax break in the budget, there is a $300 billion problem with Medicare, and we have to cut the budget. There are those of us who are somewhat cynical and jaded by a few years in Washington who suspect that in good part we're supposedly decreasing Medicare expenditures in order to save the program, at the same time that it seems to somewhat parallel the decreases in the revenues flowing into the federal government. Medicare has its problems. It certainly does. We passed one tiny part of something that might be part of a solution already in the House this year, which is to authorize the 50 states to implement HMO alternatives, voluntary alternatives for seniors on Medicare. Something that might work in the Portland area, might work in other major urban areas, isn't going to work very well in rural areas in most of my district where there is no competition and no real opportunity for HMOs. That is not a grand part of the solution, but it may be a part. Beyond that, we've got to do some heretical things, like look at the fact that we subsidize Medicare Part B premiums by 75%. That is, seniors pay 25% of the cost. Now, under the Republican plan, I suspect every senior is going to pay a bunch more in order to raise part of that $290 billion. I would propose instead that perhaps what we do is have a progressive premium, and at some income level in retirement, your subsidy is phased out. But people at the lower end, people only dependent upon Social Security, and other people retiring to make ends meet as seniors, don't see any increase and maybe even a decrease in their premiums, because right now a lot of them can't even afford the prescription drugs that might come after they finally get to see the doctor, if they can afford the copayment. Beyond that, we cannot approach Medicare separate from the rest of the medical system. We're engaged in this horrendous game of cost shifting. We don't deny medical care to the 37 million uninsured people. They come into the hospital, those costs get shifted somewhere. They get shifted onto Medicare, they get shifted onto private pay. If we dramatically decrease Medicare reimbursements, which again seems to be where they're headed with this plan, I mean, they just came up with a number to cut and didn't say what were the elements of it or how they were going to save it. That's to be decided later, but they knew how much exactly they wanted to cut. I would say that, you know, we should approach that in, you know, in such a way that we decide first what needs to be done and then decide what it costs and whether it warrants a tax increase, a premium increase, or reductions in expenditures. But if we just overall lower the expenditures of Medicare, more and more hospitals, already hospitals in my district, efficient hospitals like Sacred Heart, are losing money on Medicare procedures, and they're shifting the costs onto private pay patients. You know, that will get worse. So everybody, we're just going to be very ineffectively and inefficiently shifting costs around. One other point, and I get carried away on the medical issue, but you know, we're not getting the efficiencies of the system either. Oregon, the Northwest, is one of the most efficient providers of medical services in the country. Look at the profile of Medicare reimbursements in Oregon and compare it to New York State or Pennsylvania. They will reimburse twice as much for the same procedure for some odd reason, because they haven't even tried to save money in those states. Yet when they lower the reimbursement, they lower it 10% in Oregon and they lower it 10% in Pennsylvania. They should be lowered 40 or 50%, and we should be held where we're at because actually we're so efficient now, we've got hospitals losing money. So it's got to be approached in a much more thoughtful manner than just saying, we'll cut $290 billion, that'll save it, and we'll figure out later what we're going to do.
Dan Goldie, City Club member. Peter, on the argument one hears most often on the budget problem, deficit problem, is that if states can balance their budget, if businesses can do it, if individuals can do it, municipalities can do it, why can't the federal government? But as you know, every one of them separates out operating costs from capital costs. And I'd like to ask you this question. If we did that in the federal budget, what would the deficit be, if you know? And secondly, why aren't, given your understanding of the importance of infrastructure investments to the soundness of the U.S. economy and international competitiveness, why aren't you making that a condition of your case for a balanced budget?
Well, I am a sponsor of a bill in the House which would in fact move the infrastructure investment funds, the trust funds, off budget, and would have the money spent out of those funds as it flows into those funds. That is, as much revenue as we create, we would invest it. Right now, the Surface Transportation Trust Fund has a near $20 billion surplus in it that isn't being spent, which President Clinton tried to spend with his stimulus package in the first Congress, but was filibustered by the Republicans. But it's a growing surplus in the Surface Transportation Trust Fund, because every year we spend less than comes in because it's artificially counted as part of the budget. The balanced budget amendment does not set the rules for what is going to be considered part or not part, and I don't think you put in the Constitution a whole bunch of things that says, well, the current gas tax will be considered off budget, Social Security, this and that. All those things, that's the argument to engage in after we set the size of the playing field and we determine we're going to a balanced budget. Then we have the argument over the trust funds. I want to take the trust funds out, and I want to assure that the money is spent for the purposes for which the tax is collected. I think that, unfortunately, we're probably not going to prevail in the House, but we've got almost 200 co-sponsors on that bill. We're not far off. If Speaker Gingrich would support it, we could pass it. And that's where we're at right now. He keeps telling the chairman, Bud Schuster, he might support it, but he hasn't yet. And right now, Mr. Kasich, who's a hardliner on the Budget Committee, says everything should be counted as part of the budget, is winning that debate.
John Leeper, City Club member. I've got two questions, sir. First, if it has taken us 13 years to so significantly balloon our national debt, what is so cussed magic about settling it and resolving it in 7 years? Why not 10? Why not 12? Why not the 13 years it took us to get in this mess? Secondly, I don't understand why when people talk of savings, they talk about a 5-year time span. And it's just my perspective that they like it because it is a bigger, more impressive number, and they don't want to talk about this is what we're going to do this year.
Well, actually, there's nothing magic about 2002. It could be 2003, 4, or 5. I don't have a tremendous dispute with that. I happen to think that the budget I've drawn up, we could get to balance in 7 years without being somewhat of a Keynesian, a tremendous disruption or problem with the economy if the Federal Reserve Board would behave itself during that time period. And what we're doing is we're not solving the problem in 7 years. If we get to a balanced budget in the year 2002 and we maintain a balanced budget in the year 2032, we will have solved the problem. That is 37 years, because it would take another 30 years to pay off the obligations the federal government currently has outstanding. They're all for different terms, but there are many 30-year bonds outstanding and would be in the year 2002. So actually, we're going to take 37 years to get there. We're going to take 7 years to get to a point where we're beginning to chip away at it. So I think 37 years, I know I won't be in Congress, I don't even expect I'll probably be here, is a pretty long time span. And that basically says that our kids' generation might get to see the mortgage on the federal government burned, and their kids will get to live in a society where taxes are going for current operations and not for past excesses.
I'm Pete Heuser, a City Club member. I'm sorry to beat the federal budget to death, but we don't get a chance to talk to Congress people very often. Given the fact that the balanced budget amendment is not going to happen for at least the time being, how do you reconcile, how do you come to agreement with your cohorts across the aisle? You've talked about some of your pet programs, education, mass transit. We might have a Republican here that would talk about how we can't cut defense spending, how that has to grow. The fact is, in the past, it seems that nothing's been cut, and so we all lose. How are you going to control spending and balance the budget without the rule of a balanced budget amendment so that we all can win?
Well, I supported the balanced budget amendment, and I thought we needed the gimmick. So in part, I would say to you, I think you're right, which is I supported the balanced budget amendment because I thought that we needed those kind of constraints. But absent the balanced budget amendment, I'm saying we may still be able to succeed if we keep in mind, and I think choosing a year, whether it's 2002, 3, 4, or 5, but it should be within that, at least within that 10-year period, where you say we are going to get to balance in that period of time, and perhaps revise the budget resolution and have to show progress every year toward that. So we've just got to hold people's feet to the fire, and the point is, I'm willing to have the debate about priorities, and if I lose and a majority chooses different priorities, then the American people will get to pass judgment on those priorities in the next election. And I think if we adopt the priorities of this budget, that we'll probably see the House of Representatives go back to the Democrats or to something else, whether it's a third party, in 2 years, because I don't believe the American people are going to think it's a priority to give tax breaks to the people who have already done very well, thank you very much, the largest corporations, and to increase the military to fight an elusive, non-existent Soviet empire. We're spending $60 billion to defend Japan against the Soviet Union, $100 billion to defend Europe against the Soviet Union. We're running a $30 billion trade deficit, $20 billion with Germany, $60 billion with Japan. Something's wrong with that picture. They don't seem to think there's a threat. They're putting less than 1% of their GDP into defending themselves. We're putting a much greater percentage in to defend them. If there's a threat, then perhaps they should be ready to defend themselves and take more of a share of the burden. I feel very strongly about that. And I'm right. I know I'm right.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. There's an article in last month's Atlantic Monthly that argues that the U.S. Congress has become too democratic an institution. That's democratic with a lowercase d. That is, the thesis of this, the author, is that the institution is too responsive to public opinion and to various interest groups. With Congress members routinely now living in their districts and commuting to Washington, D.C., and the sort of newest wave is the congressperson who's wired into the net and can get an instant response from his constituents or others who are interested in legislation. I'd like your comments on whether or not the institution is now too responsive and whether we need a little more sort of removal from maybe the hurly-burly of public opinion.
Well, I've been carrying last month's Atlantic around. I saw that on the cover. I haven't had a chance to read the article. I'll be interested in the thesis, but I happen to disagree. I happen to be one who is wired into the internet. I was the first member of the House to have a home page. I have a web page at the University of Oregon. I am one who lives in my home district, and I think I'm better for it, my district is better for it, that I don't adopt the myopia of Washington, D.C. So I would point you to a different source of reading. Sort of my current guru, who's a guy named Kevin Phillips, who actually was one of the architects of the Reagan Revolution, but then sort of turned on the Republicans after they'd been in power a couple of years because he really didn't think they were doing the right things with the control, and has become an independent political analyst. You hear him sometimes on NPR. And he wrote a book called Arrogant Capital, and it's a play on words. And it's a play on words in that capital meaning money and the control of Washington, D.C., and he says it doesn't matter much whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. The permanent establishment, particularly the moneyed interests, particularly the largest corporations, control the policy to a significant extent. And so I think that the trend of people not being so much citizens and residents of Washington, D.C., even though apparently we're about to become the D.C. City Council and try and bail them out. I've always wanted to be in a city council, but you know, that's going to be interesting. But beyond that, I don't live there. You know, I live here, I work there. And I devote adequate time to being there to do my job, but not to become part of the inside the Beltway culture. And secondly, the other point he makes is that arrogant capital is also in terms of capital, the capital of the nation and sort of the permanent administrative federal bureaucracy. It's an interesting book, and he'll point you in a very different direction. What he happens to predict is that we're not going to be a two-party system much longer, and that we're going to head toward a much more fractioned multi-party system, and he has some historic parallels, which are a little tortured, which point to that.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, Tom Palmersheim, City Club member. Congressman DeFazio, I'm rather surprised that you line up with the so-called right-wing ideologues in your support for the phase-out of foreign aid, whether politically popular or not. As you know, we already spend a smaller percentage of our GDP on foreign aid than any other major industrial power. Do you honestly believe that our nation's security would be enhanced by moving our support for the UN and for foreign aid towards zero while still spending hundreds of billions of dollars in defense and for defense hardware?
Sure. Well, I didn't mention the UN, and I have supported UN funding, although I think it's at this point a miserably managed and run organization, and they've got to get a sense of fiscal responsibility there too. But I support and have supported the UN. No, I don't support borrowing money to give to people. And obviously the hot button issue is Israel. Shouldn't we support Israel? Yes. Should we guarantee the integrity of Israel? Yes. Should we forever give them money to prop up their economy? No. I'd like to see a self-sufficiency plan from Israel to phase out the $3 billion a year we give them, and because we give them $3 billion a year, we have to give Egypt $3 billion a year, and in Egypt they're stealing all of the $3 billion we're giving them. Go to Egypt. It's a miserable country. It isn't getting to the people. It's not getting to infrastructure. It's not getting to housing. It's being stolen by the leaders of that country. So we're bribing them $3 billion a year because they entered into a peace process 17 years ago, and it's not helping anybody in that country except a few corrupt politicians. That's not a good expenditure of our resources. If we're going to do foreign aid, we should do things like micro-enterprise loans where we know $500 went to a villager to buy a sewing machine, or a few $100s went to a village to build a water supply system, a simple well, or something like that. But the system we have today of dumping billions of dollars in the leaders of corrupt countries all around the world, or even good democracies around the world, is not a system that we should perpetuate. It's a very Cold War way of thinking. If you have to buy your friends, they aren't great friends.
Congressman DeFazio, on behalf of all the membership of this club who are here today and the many listeners on our radio system, let me say stimulating, energetic, keep at it. This meeting is adjourned.